In the wood-paneled library of the Whitmore estate, surrounded by family attorneys and a dynasty that had never considered him their equal, Blair slid a divorce filing across the table and told Gavin Hale he would leave that night with nothing but a single suitcase. Her father leaned back and smiled like a man who had expelled something unworthy from his bloodline. Gavin did not argue the house, the shares, or the car registered in his name. He signed every page, removed his wedding ring, and stood. When the family attorney declared the Whitmores the clear winners, Gavin smiled and said 3 words, "Read Exhibit 12. The room went completely silent. Subscribe now, because the clause Gavin left behind will force every member of that family to come back and beg. The night it began publicly started not in a courtroom but on a stage, beneath lights that had cost more than most people earned in a year, in a ballroom at the Whitmore Aeromotive headquarters in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. The company was announcing its pending acquisition by Atlas Dominion, a global energy and transportation conglomerate, for a sum of $6.8 billion. The largest transaction in Michigan's automotive industry in 2 decades. Gavin Hale stood at the far edge of the room, near the service corridor where staff moved quietly between trays of untouched hors d'oeuvres, and he watched his brother-in-law walk onto the stage to a standing ovation. Dorian Whitmore, 34 years old and impeccably dressed, accepted a handshake from the Atlas delegation and told every camera in the room that the breakthrough safety system at the heart of the deal had been the product of his vision, his team, and the relentless Whitmore pursuit of engineering excellence. The press release distributed to every outlet that evening described Dorian as the architectural mind behind the Sentinel thermal matrix, the proprietary system credited with making Whitmore the safest manufacturer of electric vehicles on the American market. Gavin's name did not appear in the release, not on the program, not on the projected slides, and not in any of the technical summaries handed to Atlas's representatives as evidence of the company's intellectual property portfolio. Gavin had known this moment was coming because he had been watching the erasure happen slowly for 3 years, one document revision at a time, the way water carves stone, not through force but through endless patience. He did not interrupt Dorian's remarks. He did not seek out a microphone or pull aside one of the Atlas executives to correct the record. He stood where he was because Blair was on that stage too, seated in the front row with every evidence of authority, and because he understood that a public confrontation at the moment of her company's most important night would only be used as evidence that he was the problem, not the lie being told behind a podium. Camille Whitmore, 63 years old, and wearing the kind of confidence that only old money manufactures, found Gavin during the reception and introduced him to a group of institutional investors as Blair's husband, the one who stays home. One of those investors, a man who managed a fund worth more than several small nations, glanced at Gavin's dress shoes rather than his face, and then held out a set of car keys, apparently under the impression that Gavin was on staff as the evening's valet. Gavin held the keys for a moment, then set them down on the table beside the man's champagne glass and excused himself in silence. Blair had watched the exchange from 15 feet away and had said nothing, smiled politely at the investor, and turned back to her conversation as though the moment had not occurred. Later that evening, when the crowd had thinned and the lighting had been adjusted for the intimate dinner that followed the announcement, Gavin found Blair near the window of the main reception hall and asked her, quietly, why his name had been removed from the engineering attribution records that had been submitted to Atlas as part of the due diligence package. Blair did not look at him with guilt. She looked at him with the particular exhaustion of someone who had made a decision and resented being asked to justify it again. She told him this was not the moment to relitigate who deserved credit for what, and that the company needed to present a clean narrative to the buyers. Gavin pointed out that clean and false were different things, and Blair repeated his name in that clipped, precise way she had when a conversation was already over for her, even if the other person hadn't stopped speaking. Augustus Whitmore, 68 years old and the family patriarch, materialized at his daughter's side within moments, a talent he had always possessed, appearing exactly when the dynamic needed reinforcement, and told Gavin that a man who had lived in the Whitmore estate for 6 years, driven Whitmore vehicles, and attended Whitmore events on Blair's invitation might consider gratitude before grievance. That night, after the last guest had left and the staff had begun clearing glasses, Blair set a folder on the kitchen counter of the east wing where they slept, and she told Gavin she needed him to meet with the family attorneys in the morning. The folder contained a divorce filing. She said their marriage had become an obstacle to the company's future. Gavin looked at the folder, then at his wife, and asked whether she was certain she understood what actually belonged to Whitmore and what did not. 8 years earlier, Gavin had met Blair during a crisis. Whitmore Aeromotive's flagship electric sedan had been experiencing thermal runaway incidents. The moment a battery pack generates heat faster than it can release it, leading to a fire that no extinguisher can stop. 3 vehicles had caught fire within 6 months. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration was preparing a formal inquiry, and Whitmore's legal team was preparing for a recall that would have cost the company over $400 million and likely its reputation entirely. Gavin Hale was an independent battery safety engineer who had spent 12 years working on the precise problem of thermal propagation in lithium battery arrays, how to identify a failing cell cluster before the failure became a cascade. When he presented his diagnosis, he refused a consulting fee of $300,000 contingent on limiting the recall to a software patch, rather than a full physical inspection of every unit sold. He said the only acceptable outcome was complete transparency with the Transportation Authority, and he was willing to walk away if Whitmore chose otherwise. Blair had been in that room, not yet CEO, working under her father as a divisional executive, and she had watched Gavin turn down more money than most engineers earned in a decade because he believed the right answer was the right answer, regardless of its price. They began talking over the following weeks as the recall was managed, and then continued talking after the technical work was done, because Gavin was the first person Blair had encountered in her professional life who did not treat her as a Whitmore first and a human being second. He knew who her family was. He simply did not care about it in the way everyone else did. When they married 3 years later, Gavin brought something to Whitmore Aeromotive that no acquisition could have purchased: the complete technology behind the Sentinel thermal matrix, the system he had spent the intervening years perfecting from the initial diagnostic insight into a full proprietary framework for real-time battery safety management. He did not sell Sentinel to Whitmore. He licensed it under terms drawn up by his attorney, Evelyn Shaw, and structured through a trust entity called Hale Legacy Trust, which held the patents in its name for the benefit of his daughter Harper, who was 11 years old at the time and had lost her mother 2 years before. The license was essentially zero cost during the period Gavin served as the company's independent safety advisor, and the terms were clear. Whitmore could use the technology freely, but the technology was never theirs. Augustus had opposed the arrangement with a vehemence that never fully subsided, because the idea of something this central to the company's future being owned by a man he considered an outsider was a structural insult to everything he believed about how families and empires were built. He had simply never found a legal way to change it. What he had found, eventually, was a way around it. In the 3 years before the Atlas deal was announced, Dorian had quietly begun revising the internal attribution of Sentinel's development. He replaced Gavin's name with his own in presentation materials, then in internal reports, then in the technical dossier prepared for Atlas. He presented the system's architecture to Whitmore's board as though he were explaining something he had built, using vocabulary he had absorbed from Gavin's memos, and speaking with the authority of a man who had practiced the delivery in private until the impersonation felt like memory. Gavin had raised this with Blair twice in writing, and once in an extended conversation during which she had not denied the substitution, but had framed it as a presentation strategy rather than fraud. When Gavin found the Atlas disclosure package and saw that the ownership of Sentinel had been formally represented to the buyers as belonging entirely to Whitmore Aeromotive, he told Blair that she needed to correct it before anything was signed, because the representation was not just inaccurate, it was legally untenable. Blair told him that changing the documentation at that stage would cause Atlas to pause the deal over questions about ownership provenance, and that a pause of that kind could kill $6.8 billion of value and thousands of jobs over what she characterized as a question of attribution. She asked Gavin to sign a document confirming that Whitmore held full rights to Sentinel. He refused because Sentinel was held in trust for Harper. Augustus framed the refusal as an act of sabotage against his own wife's future. Blair, who had held a board seat that depended entirely on her father's support, made the choice that every decision she had made in the previous 3 years had been rehearsing her to make. The morning after the Atlas announcement, Gavin woke to find the joint bank account inaccessible, his building access card deactivated, and a single packed suitcase sitting near the bedroom door. Augustus Whitmore organized the divorce signing not at a law office, but at the estate's formal library, where the family had historically conducted the kind of business they believed deserved an audience. He invited Camille, Dorian, and 2 members of Whitmore Aeromotive's board to attend as witnesses, and he chose a Tuesday morning in early November when the estate would be staffed lightly and the surrounding grounds would be cold and gray, a setting calibrated to communicate finality. Preston Vale, 57 years old and Whitmore's senior commercial attorney, read through the terms of the settlement aloud in the patient, unhurried voice of a man who had done this before. The terms were thorough and, on the surface, clean. Gavin would not receive the estate, would not receive any portion of Blair's equity in Whitmore Aeromotive, would not receive any share of the proceeds from the Atlas transaction, would return the vehicle registered in the company's name along with all associated credit instruments and access credentials, would resign from his position as independent safety advisor effective immediately upon signing, and would not make any public statements claiming ownership or co-ownership of any technology developed during the marriage. Gavin read each page with the careful attention of a man who was not surprised by a single word on any of them, because he had read an earlier version of these same terms 2 weeks before in the documents Blair had left on the counter. He noticed, as Preston reached the final clauses, that the language around his resignation from the advisory position was unusually broad. It did not specify a transition period, did not reference any existing licensing arrangement, and did not acknowledge the existence of Hale Legacy Trust or the structure through which Sentinel had been made available to the company. He noted this in the same way a carpenter notes a structural gap in a frame, without alarm, because the gap was expected. Augustus, evidently reading Gavin's composure as uncertainty, made an additional offer not reflected in the prepared documents, $500,000 in personal funds, payable within 30 days, in exchange for a separate instrument assigning full patent rights in Sentinel to Whitmore Aeromotive. The offer told Gavin everything he needed to confirm. If the family already owned what they claimed to own, there would be no reason to buy it. He declined without elaboration. Dorian laughed and said Gavin had just refused the only offer he would ever receive from this family. Camille asked two members of the security staff to check the contents of Gavin's suitcase before he left the property, framing the request as a standard precaution. The staff complied. The suitcase contained folded clothing, a photograph of Harper taken at her high school graduation, a worn metal toolkit, and a spiral-bound technical notebook. Dorian reached for the notebook. Gavin said calmly that the notebook was documented personal property registered under Hale Legacy Trust, and that removing it from his possession would constitute unauthorized taking of trust-held assets. Dorian set it back. Blair sat across the table and watched all of this without speaking, watching her husband treated like a man suspected of theft in a house he had lived in for 6 years, and she did not intervene. Gavin looked at Blair across the table and asked her for the last time before the papers were signed whether she genuinely wanted him to proceed. She said that the transaction represented the security of thousands of employees and the culmination of what her family had built across 3 generations, and that the feelings of one person could not outweigh that. Gavin recognized in the phrasing not a statement of priority but an erasure. The feelings of one person, and he understood that the woman he had married had not been replaced by this version. She had become it. Before he picked up the pen, he took out his phone and sent a single message to Evelyn Shaw. It read, "They activated it." While Preston was gathering the final signature pages, Gavin's phone rang. He stepped briefly to the corner and answered to his daughter's voice. Harper was 19. Studying mechanical engineering at the University of Michigan, and she had known since the previous week that the signing was happening, and had spent the intervening days resisting the impulse to drive home and put herself between her father and the family that had been methodically diminishing him. She asked whether he needed her there. Gavin told her to stay for her scheduled exam and not to let any of this interrupt the semester. She asked why he wasn't fighting it in real time, why he wasn't bringing Evelyn into the room, why he was letting them believe they had won. He told her, in the precise and measured language he had used with her since she was small enough to need it simplified, that he needed the family to finalize the termination voluntarily and in writing, with witnesses present and a court reporter capturing the proceedings. Because if he surfaced Exhibit 12 before they signed, Augustus would have the documents altered overnight and would find a way to retain the license while still removing Gavin from the picture. The trap only worked if it was sprung after the door closed. Harper was quiet for a moment and then said she trusted him. He told her to call him after the exam. After he ended the call, Blair looked at him with an expression that was a mixture of suspicion and something that might once have been curiosity, and she asked whether he was using Harper to create an emotional spectacle. The question landed in Gavin like a stone dropped into still water. It told him that Blair no longer extended him the baseline assumption of good faith, that when she looked at him now, she searched for the angle first. He set his phone on the table, told her he had not asked for any financial support, and picked up the pen. Camille offered the observation that pride could not cover a lease payment. Augustus, with the magnanimity of a man granting clemency to someone beneath his notice, produced a key and told Gavin that a 1-bedroom apartment in Royal Oak was available through a property the family held, and that he was welcome to use it on a month-to-month basis as a gesture of goodwill. Gavin said he had already arranged a room above a former workshop near the Rouge River district and declined the gesture. Dorian said that within 3 weeks Gavin would be standing outside the estate, asking to renegotiate. Gavin set down the pen for a moment and asked Preston to confirm 3 things clearly before the assembled witnesses: that the divorce would take effect at the moment of signing, that Gavin would be removed from all professional roles at Whitmore Aeromotive immediately and without a transition period, and that the company was formally declaring it held no further professional or contractual obligation to him. Preston confirmed all 3. Gavin signed each page, initialed each exhibit, and worked through the document without a single question or hesitation. When he lifted his hand from the last page, Blair was watching him with something that was not quite triumph and not quite peace. She asked why he was smiling. He said that he had just received the last element he needed, the signatures of the entire family confirming, before witnesses, that they had voluntarily and permanently terminated the professional relationship. Preston closed the portfolio and announced that as of that moment, Mr. Hale held no further interests of any kind in the Whitmore family, its assets, or its affiliated entities. Gavin rose from the table and said, "Read Exhibit 12. Augustus made a sound that was almost a laugh. He said that old boilerplate in a prenuptial annex was not going to change the outcome of a signed and witnessed divorce settlement. Dorian asked what, precisely, Gavin imagined a forgotten exhibit from a marriage contract was going to accomplish against $6.8 billion and the most powerful transaction attorneys in the state of Michigan. Preston Vale, because he was thorough in the way only experienced attorneys manage to be thorough, opened the referenced exhibits file, a technical attachment incorporated by reference into the prenuptial agreement, and began reading Exhibit 12. The room was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when the person reading is reading more slowly and more carefully than they intended to begin. The exhibit was 6 pages, signed by Augustus Whitmore, Blair Whitmore, and 2 sitting board members, and its language was precise. The Sentinel thermal matrix system and all associated patents, derivatives, and algorithmic structures remained the exclusive property of Hale Legacy Trust and were licensed to Whitmore Aeromotive solely during the period in which Gavin Hale held an active role as the company's independent safety advisor. The license was granted at no cost, but was conditioned on that role. Any action taken to remove Gavin from that role without the written consent of Hale Legacy Trust would trigger an automatic and immediate termination of the license. Any corporate transaction that transferred operational control of Whitmore Aeromotive to a third party required a separate confirmation instrument from the patent holder before the transaction could be deemed complete. Preston set the exhibit down on the table and picked up the divorce settlement, which the entire room had just signed and witnessed. He read the relevant clause. The settlement required Gavin's immediate removal from all professional roles and included the company's formal declaration of no remaining obligation to him. He looked at the exhibit. He looked at the settlement. He set both documents side by side and was quiet for approximately 8 seconds. Augustus said that a board resolution from the prior year had formally transferred all rights in Sentinel from the trust to the company. That the exhibit was superseded. Gavin asked Preston whether that board resolution carried the signature of Hale Legacy Trust's trustee or had been filed with the United States Patent and Trademark Office as a registered assignment of intellectual property rights. Preston looked through the portfolio he had brought. He looked through it again. He said, in the careful voice of an attorney who does not say what he has not confirmed, that he did not see evidence of either. Dorian said it did not matter because Whitmore had the code, the servers, the deployed infrastructure. They could continue using the system whether a paper license had technically expired or not. Gavin pointed out, without raising his voice, that using the system after the license had expired would not be continuation of a prior agreement. It would be willful infringement, which under federal patent law carried per violation damages calculated at the higher end, precisely because willfulness had been established. He also pointed out that the disclosure package submitted to Atlas Dominion represented Whitmore as the exclusive owner of Sentinel as a condition of the purchase price, and that representation was now, as of the moment the divorce settlement was signed, demonstrably false. Preston understood before anyone else in the room. He knew that if Atlas discovered this discrepancy in its own due diligence review, and Atlas employed attorneys as experienced as he was. The company could invoke fraudulent misrepresentation and walk away entirely. He stepped out briefly and returned with confirmation. Atlas had scheduled an ownership verification review for 8 o'clock the following morning. Without a valid license from Gavin, the sale could not close as structured. The company's valuation would be reassessed against a technology base that no longer included Sentinel, which meant against a safety profile that most of its new production line could not meet without it. The people who had been smiling 20 minutes ago were no longer smiling. Camille asked Gavin how much he wanted. Dorian said he would arrange for the car to be transferred back into Gavin's name by the end of the day. Augustus stood and told Preston to identify a legal mechanism to nullify the divorce settlement retroactively. Preston said there was no such mechanism that could be applied unilaterally to a fully executed agreement signed by all parties and witnessed by a court reporter. Gavin picked up his suitcase, said nothing, and walked toward the library door. Augustus called after him using his name, his actual given name, for the first time in 6 years of encounters in which the man had called him the battery man, the mechanic, the one who fixes things, and various other titles intended to communicate that a man without inherited wealth was a man without a real name. "Gavin," he said, "we need to discuss this." Gavin reached the door and did not turn around. He said, "You had 6 years to have that conversation." Gavin left the estate in a car belonging to a former colleague because the divorce terms had been explicit about his obligation to return the vehicle he had been using, and he had honored them precisely, which was exactly the kind of behavior that made what came next very difficult for anyone to frame as bad faith. The Whitmore family convened an emergency meeting in the dining room within 40 minutes of his departure. Dorian proposed that the engineering team immediately begin working on a version of the Sentinel architecture under a new internal name, rebuilt from the deployed codebase already running in the company's production vehicles. The engineering director told Dorian that the system contained a distributed authentication structure that updated itself periodically through servers registered to Hale Legacy Trust. The update cycle was not cosmetic. The authentication layer was integral to the thermal regulation logic, and without authorization from the trust, the safety verification updates would cease to propagate within 72 hours of the license expiration. The vehicles already sold and in use on American roads would continue to function. The system was stable in deployment, but Whitmore could not manufacture, test, certify, or sell any new vehicle using the Sentinel architecture without a valid authorization key, and the authorization key lived on servers it did not own. Atlas Dominion's acquisition team sent a formal request for clarification of the ownership structure within 3 hours of the morning meeting. Augustus instructed Blair to call Gavin directly and propose a resolution. Gavin did not answer when Blair called. He was moving into a rented room on the 2nd floor of a former machine shop off Michigan Avenue, a folding cot, a small writing table, a window overlooking a loading dock. He had walked out of the Whitmore estate with the suitcase the security team had already searched, and his financial position consisted of a checking account he had maintained independently throughout the marriage. Evelyn Shaw arrived at the workshop the following morning with a document case and a paper cup of coffee. She spread the original signed copies of Exhibit 12 on the writing table and confirmed that Gavin's legal position was precisely what he had understood it to be. She also told him to prepare himself for Whitmore's next move, which would not be legal in nature. 3 days later, a source described in media coverage as someone close to Whitmore Aeromotive's leadership told 2 financial journalists that Gavin Hale had engineered the divorce specifically to use a licensing technicality as leverage in a personal dispute, that he was in essence holding thousands of jobs hostage over wounded pride. One wire service ran the story under a headline describing him as a disgruntled former spouse attempting to extract a windfall from a pending acquisition. A second outlet produced a longer piece featuring unnamed board members, calling him a contractor who had confused a consulting arrangement with ownership. Blair did not distribute these stories. She also did not correct them. Gavin was standing outside the workshop one morning when a stranger shouted at him from across the street, repeating language from the coverage almost verbatim. He received letters from Whitmore employees asking him not to close the plant. He read each one, then called Evelyn and told her he was not willing to weaponize working people to punish a family. He authorized continued safety updates for all deployed vehicles already on public roads, voluntary as a matter of public safety, not leverage, and issued a statement through Evelyn that addressed only existing vehicles and offered no commentary on the family. The statement dismantled the narrative that he was attempting to cause harm. Atlas elected to suspend the transaction rather than cancel, and requested an independent review of the intellectual property chain of title. Shareholders filed written demands asking for an explanation of why the actual inventor had been erased from every document submitted to the buyer. In the executive corridor, Dorian began reviewing internal server logs and found entries documenting his access to Gavin's original source architecture files. Access that had occurred without authorization on dates that preceded his first public presentation of Sentinel as his own work. He made the decision that people who have built their position on borrowed credit often make when exposure becomes imminent. He redirected the liability toward the person with the most authority to absorb it. In the board meeting called the following week, Dorian presented a timeline that placed Blair at the center of every decision related to Gavin's removal from the company's documentation. He said she had personally directed the attribution change. He said the CEO had final authority over all external disclosures and therefore final responsibility for their content. Augustus, who had orchestrated the entire sequence from the initial decision to exclude Gavin through the structure of the divorce settlement itself, supported his son's framing in front of the same board he had appointed. Blair sat in that meeting and recognized, with the specific clarity that arrives only when the ground beneath a person's assumptions collapses all at once, that she had never been an asset to her father's plan. She had been the mechanism. Preston Vale, who had been retained for decades by Augustus personally, obtained copies of the internal communications that had passed between Augustus and Dorian in the months before the Atlas announcement. He brought them to Blair in silence, set them in front of her, and waited while she read. The emails confirmed that both men had known Exhibit 12 remained in force. They had also known that Gavin would not voluntarily transfer the trust's rights, and that the only viable path was to create conditions under which he would be removed from the company's orbit entirely before the transaction closed, leaving him legally separated from the enterprise, publicly framed as the obstruction rather than the asset, and practically unable to contest the outcome without being characterized as a disgruntled ex-husband rather than a patent holder. The divorce had never been about the marriage. It had been a legal instrument designed to strip Gavin of his advisory role, and thereby trigger the license termination, before anyone confirmed in writing that the termination would have that effect. Blair remembered a dinner 2 years earlier, at which Gavin had placed a printed email in front of her and explained, with patient precision, that Dorian had been submitting safety certification reports that omitted known defect data. She had told Gavin that he was misreading internal communication practices and that Dorian's reports went through a review process. She had told herself that she was protecting the company from family conflict. She had been protecting the approval of a father who had designed the entire situation to end with her signature on a document that expelled her husband. Atlas Dominion required a joint meeting involving Gavin, Blair, and the full board within 5 business days. Gavin arrived with Evelyn Shaw and presented the complete development history of Sentinel. Original design schematics predating the marriage, the full patent filing history registered under Hale Legacy Trust, every communication in which Whitmore's own legal and engineering teams had acknowledged the trust's ownership, and test logs proving the system had entered Whitmore's production line from outside the company. Dorian interrupted 3 times. On the 3rd interruption, Gavin connected a laptop and ran a recording from a board presentation 4 years prior, in which Dorian, asked to walk through the thermal regulation algorithm at the core of Sentinel, admitted the mathematical detail sat with the trust's technical team and that he was not in a position to explain it. The Atlas representatives delivered a written finding characterizing the ownership disclosure in the merger filing as materially inaccurate. The transaction was suspended. The board voted to place both Dorian and Augustus on administrative suspension pending investigation. Augustus turned to Blair across the table and told her that as CEO she needed to resolve this before it became unrecoverable. Blair told him she would handle it. She drove to the workshop on Michigan Avenue. She stood in the doorway and saw her ex-husband sitting at the writing table beneath a window that framed a loading dock, surrounded by the stacked boxes of a life recently moved into a space a fraction the size of the estate's guest wing. It was simply where he lived. She told him she was prepared to initiate a restoration of the marriage, return the estate to joint title, and make him whole financially if he would sign an emergency license for the pending Atlas review. Gavin looked at her for a moment before answering. He said the house and the marriage could not be used as consideration for a signature on a technology agreement, because treating them that way turned every intimate thing they had shared into a line item in a transaction, and he was no longer willing to live inside that framing. She asked what he actually wanted from her. He said, "For once in your life, decide what the right thing is without first calculating what it's going to cost you." Blair returned to Whitmore headquarters and ordered a complete forensic audit of every technical document, board resolution, and external disclosure that had passed through Dorian's office in the preceding 4 years. The audit took 11 days. The findings were delivered in a report of 240 pages, and the summary was not ambiguous. Dorian had fabricated the board resolution that had been presented to Augustus as proof of a Sentinel ownership transfer, including a forged trustee signature that bore no resemblance to Evelyn Shaw's actual signature on record. He had submitted patent-adjacent filings to the Atlas due diligence team using attribution language that removed Gavin's name and substituted generic internal references that implied company origin. He had accessed Gavin's original source files through an administrator credential that had not been his to use and had copied structural architecture from those files into internal documents used in board presentations to claim credit for the system's design. He had also suppressed 12 safety-related defect flags in the 2 most recent Whitmore vehicle models. Defects that Gavin had originally identified in his capacity as safety advisor and had logged in the trust's own records. In order to keep the launch timeline intact and preserve the company's valuation for the Atlas negotiation. Augustus had reviewed a summary of the defect situation and had authorized the suppression in writing. The practical situation was now this. Without a new license authorization from Gavin, the Whitmore manufacturing facility would be unable to produce or certify vehicles using the Sentinel architecture within 72 hours. More than 4,000 workers would face a production halt. The halt would trigger layoff provisions in their employment contracts within 2 weeks. Gavin was not willing to let the workforce absorb punishment for decisions that none of them had participated in or benefited from. he was also not willing to hand back control of a technology to the same individuals who had forged documents to steal it. The Whitmore family came to him, not through intermediaries, not by phone, not through attorneys. They came to the workshop on Michigan Avenue, all of them, on a cold morning with a forecast of early snow, and they stood in the parking area outside the loading dock where he had been working at a portable desk with a space heater 3 feet from his chair. Augustus Whitmore, who had called him the battery man and the mechanic, and every variation of diminution available to a wealthy man's vocabulary, stood in a former machine shop and waited. Camille had brought the estate key and a vehicle transfer document. Augustus made an offer of $50 million from personal holdings and a vice president position. Dorian delivered an apology structured as a clarification, framing the forgery as a document management error and suggesting that both parties had contributed to the confusion. Gavin declined all of it. He told them the reason they were there was not remorse. It was the opening bell at the financial markets. Augustus shifted into threat, warning that refusal could constitute tortious interference with a valid commercial transaction. Preston told him quietly that if litigation proceeded, the forensic audit findings would become part of the public court record and the forgery documentation would be reviewed by federal prosecutors, not a civil arbitration panel. Augustus looked at Preston in the way a man looks at a longtime advisor who has just said something he cannot counter, and he had nothing to add. Blair stepped forward before her father could recover. She did not read from notes. She said she had stood in that library and watched Gavin's suitcase searched in front of witnesses and had not spoken. She said she had signed the divorce knowing her family had acted in bad faith. She said she was not asking him to take her back. She was asking him to protect the workers while she repaired what she had broken. Camille told him the families of those 4,000 workers had nothing to do with what had happened in the library. Augustus stopped commanding and began asking, quietly without the architecture of authority in his voice. Dorian refused any admission until Gavin stated, in a voice that was completely level, that the server access logs would be forwarded to federal investigators that afternoon. Dorian then admitted to the forgery in full, on record, before a court reporter Preston had arranged. Gavin looked at the people who had ordered a security guard to search his suitcase, now standing in a parking area beside a loading dock waiting for his signature. He said, "I asked for one thing that cost none of you a single dollar. I asked you to tell the truth. Not one of you was willing to pay it." Gavin presented 4 conditions, none of which were subject to negotiation. The first was a full public restoration of the record. Whitmore Aeromotive would formally confirm Gavin Hale as the sole inventor of Sentinel, correct every document that identified Dorian as its creator, and issue a written apology to Gavin, to be delivered at a company-wide employee meeting, read by Blair personally, not routed through any communications department. The second was accountability. Dorian suspended immediately. The server access files transferred to federal authorities. Augustus resigned from the board, and neither man received departure compensation from company funds. The third was the protection of workers. Gavin would issue a 90-day license to maintain full manufacturing operations. Whitmore would establish an employee security fund drawn from the family's personal equity, not the company budget, and every suppressed safety defect would be corrected before any new production run. The fourth established the permanent structure. Sentinel remained in Hale Legacy Trust. Whitmore paid a fair market licensing fee. A portion of that fee funded engineering scholarships and battery safety research, and every future change of control transaction required an independent intellectual property audit before closing. Augustus objected to the fourth condition most strenuously, because it removed the possibility that the family would ever acquire Sentinel through any path other than negotiated license. Gavin said that Augustus was free to decline, and that if he chose to do so, The 4,000 workers at the manufacturing facility would need an explanation for why the plant was going dark, and the explanation would need to come from Augustus himself, and not from a press release. Camille put her hand on her husband's arm and told him in a low voice that the family's liquid assets were decreasing by a calculable amount for every hour the transaction remained in suspension, and that the conditions in front of them were not pleasant, but they were survivable. Blair stated, without being asked, that she was prepared to step down as CEO on a temporary basis for the duration of the formal investigation, so that the process could proceed without the appearance of executive interference. Dorian made a movement toward the edge of the group that suggested he was considering leaving. Preston told him, without inflection, that the signed confession in the court reporter's record had not become less signed because he had moved 6 feet to the left. Dorian remained. Augustus signed each condition sheet. Gavin countersigned the 90-day license instrument. He refused the return of the estate. He refused the vehicle. He did not want his vindication to be indistinguishable from a property settlement, because the difference between those two things was the only difference that had ever mattered to him. He asked for one thing: the return of the engineering notebooks that had been stored in his former office and that Dorian had relocated to a locked cabinet accessible only to executive staff. They were delivered to the workshop by end of business that day. Before the group dispersed, Blair asked whether there was any possibility of repairing the marriage once the formal proceedings had concluded. Gavin said she had the capacity to repair herself, and that he meant that genuinely, and that what she did with that capacity was hers to decide. He said their marriage had ended at the moment she watched them search his suitcase and chose silence. 3 months after the signing at the estate library, the federal investigation confirmed every finding of the internal audit. Dorian Whitmore was charged on 4 counts of document fraud and 2 counts of unauthorized access to protected computer systems. Augustus resigned from the Whitmore Aeromotive Board and surrendered his controlling interest in the family trust that had held his voting shares. The transaction with Atlas Dominion was renegotiated from the original figure downward, at a valuation that reflected the corrected ownership structure and the pending regulatory review of the suppressed safety data. But the deal was completed, clean, documented, and legally stable in the way the original version had never been. The manufacturing facility did not close. The workforce did not lose their positions. Blair returned to the company 6 weeks after the investigation concluded, not as CEO but in an operational role below the executive tier, under a board whose majority had been reconstituted without her family's appointments. At a company-wide meeting held in the same presentation hall where Dorian had stood at a podium and claimed credit for another man's decade of work, Blair read a prepared statement in front of every employee and a room of cameras. The name displayed on the presentation screen behind her, in the same position where Dorian's name had appeared at the Atlas announcement event, read Gavin Hale. The statement confirmed that the Sentinel thermal matrix system had been invented solely by Gavin Hale, that the attribution in all previous company materials had been inaccurate and would be corrected in every public and regulatory filing, and that the board wished to express its acknowledgement of the harm done to Mr. Hale and his family's trust through the events of the preceding year. Gavin was not in the room when Blair read those words. He had filed the incorporation documents for Hale Safety Systems 2 weeks after the signing, from the writing table in the rented room above the machine shop, using a lamp that tilted slightly to one side, and a chair he had borrowed from the building's owner. Within the first 30 days after the company's existence became publicly known, primarily through the federal filings, not through any announcement Gavin made, 14 engineers contacted him to express interest in joining. Most of them had worked at Whitmore. Several had been in the room the night of the Atlas announcement, standing at the edge of the ballroom, watching Dorian accept a standing ovation for work that had not been his. On the day Hale Safety Systems opened its first research facility in a converted industrial building near the Detroit River, Harper drove in from Ann Arbor and stood beside her father while the small gathering of employees and partners moved through the space. She asked him whether any part of him missed the estate, the scale of the life, the insulation from ordinary difficulty that the Whitmore world had provided for 6 years. He thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved, and then said that the largest house in the world is still a confined space for a man who has to make himself smaller in order to deserve a room inside it. Blair attended the opening. She did not take the stage and did not seek out conversation with the assembled group. She found Gavin near the end of the event, in a quieter part of the building, and handed him the technical notebook that Dorian had reached for at the signing table, the one Gavin had identified as trust property. She had retrieved it herself from the executive cabinet after the investigation concluded. She turned to Harper, who was standing nearby, and said that she owed her an apology for allowing her family to treat her father as a suspect in his own home. Harper looked at her for a long moment and said that apologies were the beginning of something, not the end of it, and that the only version of an apology that meant anything was the one that looked the same in a year as it did today. Gavin and Blair parted in the parking area without ceremony and without the performance of bitterness. She had begun the process of building a life that was hers, decisions made on the basis of what she believed rather than what her father's approval required. He signed licensing agreements with 3 additional automotive manufacturers in the months that followed, every one of them structured to preserve the trust's ownership permanently. A structure built not for the moment, but for the generation that came after him. 1 year after the signing in the library, Gavin returned to the Whitmore estate for the last time to collect a box of his first wife's belongings, photographs, a handwritten recipe book, a small collection of letters that had been stored in the estate's basement during the years of his marriage to Blair, and had been overlooked in the dissolution. Camille did not ask the staff to inspect his bag at the door. Augustus did not appear. Blair carried the box to the front gate herself and handed it to him without ceremony. She told him the house had been quieter than she could ever remember since the night he had left with the suitcase. Gavin said that silence is not always the same as peace, that sometimes it is simply the sound of a household after the person everyone underestimated is no longer there to keep things from falling apart. He placed the box in the passenger seat, drove through the gate, and did not look back. He had walked out of that estate with 1 suitcase, no house to return to, no vehicle, and not a single dollar drawn from the Whitmore family's accounts. He had kept the thing no divorce filing could transfer and no acquisition could price: his name, his work, and his unbroken right to decide what his life was actually worth. A reporter who had covered the federal case asked Gavin, at a brief press availability outside the courthouse, which 3 words had saved him on the day of the divorce. Gavin said those 3 words had not saved him. They had only required the people who had dismissed him to read something they had been too proud to understand. The same document they had signed, the same trust they had tried to bury, the same name they had spent 6 years refusing to say.